WTTW is made possible in part by viewers like you and by the following.
It started with a crown, then a bridge, then dentures. But you kept losing teeth and keeping pain. Dental implants are a permanent, custom-made answer to decay and loss, the closest thing to having your real teeth. Eon Clinics keeps the entire process under one roof, with a team that works together to make you feel at home so you can have more to give to the people you love.
Number one value is integrity. Always do the right thing.
We care about people, we want them to be safe, and we want them to know that when they come into the clinic that they're going to be safe doing that.
WTTW programming originates from the Renee Crown Public Media Center.
We're pregnant, okay.
We all started as one cell big.
There's no one right way to birth.
White people are not the only people that do IVF.
Being pregnant and still dancing, it's like a dream to me.
I'm a trans man, and I've always wanted to be a gestational dad.
The assumption is that men can't have babies. Our family turned that on its head.
Everything that it took to get here is worth it.
Wednesday at 9 on WTTW.
I'm Norma.
And I'm Gary. And you're watching WTTW Chicago.
This evening's presentation of Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by the Polk Brothers Foundation, working to make Chicago a place where all people have the opportunity to reach their full potential. Public affairs and news programming on WTTW is made possible in part by the Copeland family, in loving memory of Gene Copeland.
Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight. I'm Brandis Friedman.
And I'm Paris Schutz. On the show tonight,
one of the first cities to fully and safely reopen.
How's this for fireworks? The mayor signals the city is planning to be back by the 4th of July. We've got a COVID reopening update.
Corporate America and the wealthiest 1% just pay their fair share.
Local members of Congress weigh in on President Biden's American Families Plan, Illinois losing a House seat, and more.
Tobacco companies have long marketed menthol cigarettes to black Americans. How an FDA ban could impact communities of color.
Organizations working to reduce the number of incarcerated women in Illinois by 50% release a new report.
Cookies of the internet variety, how these tiny data files are raising privacy concerns.
The stories are what create us.
And a local theater group connecting Chicagoans one story at a time. But first, some of today's top stories. Members of the Latino community are calling on the mayor and Chicago Police Department to immediately suspend the use of foot pursuits following the deaths of 13-year-old Adam Toledo and 22-year-old Anthony Alvarez in recent months.
The police should not be allowed to set in motion a chain of events like those that took the lives of Adam and Anthony, and that cheaply value the lives of members of the community with quick and mindless resort to the use of lethal force.
The group of activists, community organizations, and attorneys are calling on the mayor to direct Superintendent David Brown to keep such a moratorium until new policies are in place that they say better protect members of the public when interacting with police. The group is also calling on the Department of Justice to again investigate CPD's policing tactics in black and brown communities. Illinois public health officials announced 2,200 more people have contracted the coronavirus and 19 people have died. That makes for a total number of 1.343 million cases and 22,066 deaths. And more than 32% of Illinois' population has been fully vaccinated. The Hoosier State has been added to Chicago's travel order. Visitors from Indiana, as well as other states seen here in orange, will now have to quarantine for 10 days or have a negative COVID test before arriving in Chicago. City officials held off on adding the state 2 weeks ago because cases were trending in the right direction, but the virus has instead spread. Meanwhile, officials moved 8 states and D.C. to the yellow tier, meaning visitors from there do not require quarantine or a negative test. Conventions, festivals, the auto show. Amanda Venicky has the latest on COVID reopenings. And Amanda, it sounds like the mayor is hoping to set a timeline this time.
Yeah, that's right, Brandes. Mayor Lori Lightfoot is hoping for a full reopening 2 months from today.
We will be able to, one of the first cities to fully and safely reopen in the nation. Our goal, ladies and gentlemen, is to be fully open by July 4th.
She made that announcement at McCormick Place, and if all goes according to plan, that will be the site of one of the first major big events of the summer, the 113th Chicago Auto Show, scheduled for July 15th through 19th. For the first time, because of COVID, some of the show will be held outdoors. Organizers mentioning test car tracks, bringing in the new Ford Bronco and an electric Mustang, also the potential for an evening street festival. Other parts of the show will be indoors.
If you were going to design a place to try to pull off an event like this, wouldn't it look like this? 40-foot ceilings, overhead fans, the best filtration that money can buy. This place is designed for what we're trying to do.
The board chair of the city's tourism wing, Choose Chicago, says given that the hospitality and tourism industry were the first and among the hardest hit by COVID and will likely be among the last to recover, this will be like Christmas in July.
It is hope for the thousands of people who can't wait to come back to work at the McCormick Place, but it is also hope for the restaurant owner, the bar owner, the hotel GM, even the cab driver or baggage handler at Midway.
The COVID shutdown cost Chicago and specifically McPier hundreds, millions of dollars in tax revenue. And the hope is that this show will not be the last. To help events planners gauge how things will go if they do bring their business back to Chicago, there's a whole Healthy Meetings website. It walks through COVID precautions and options. Now, as for hard-hit restaurant owners and workers, the Small Business Association's Restaurant Revitalization Fund is offering grants, don't have to be repaid, to help them stay open. Barbecue King House owner Sam Ma says Chinatown restaurants have suffered after a year of being able to serve only a fraction of their customers.
Some restaurants, we closed at least 6 months. Some restaurants closed over a year. That's why we need a congressman and the federal government to help us.
Now, Governor J.B. Pritzker says it's not just Chicago. Illinois is also on track to be along roughly the same reopening timeline. If COVID hospitalization rates and cases continue to go down as they are now, next week would be a bridge phase when you'd have some lifting of capacity limits. And then by this summer, a full reopening. It's a big if, though.
I emphasize something that the mayor said, which is we can't predict the future. And this virus has proven to be very challenging. The developments of variants, the times in which it's seemed to rise, surge in states like recently Michigan, for example. And of course, we all experienced November and December and January here in Illinois. So we always are on guard.
Now, officials stressing that the best way to get to that reopening is to get vaccinated. Vaccines more available than ever, even though we're seeing demand for them on the decline. As you heard earlier, only 32% of Illinoisans fully vaccinated.
Everybody here is wearing a mask. If you want to get rid of the mask, get a vaccine. Okay? Everybody that I've talked to wants to, quote, get back to normal. The way we're going to do that is get vaccinated.
And Illinois is offering up a special incentive for folks in Southern Illinois, opening up a new mobile vaccination clinic at the Worldwide Shooting and Recreation Complex in Sparta. And if you get a vaccine there anytime between now and October, you will get 100 free targets of trap, skeet, or sporting clays to use at the complex.
Hey, if you can get 100 rounds free in addition to all of that, I'm asking the governor's folks if I can bring my vaccination card in since I've already gotten it and see if I can take advantage of those 100 rounds.
Meanwhile, the Chicago Teachers Union says Mayor Lightfoot and Chicago Public Schools are not doing enough to get shots into the arms to of-age CPS students and their relatives. Mike Smith is a teacher at Englewood STEM High School, and he said this morning he predicted he'd only have about 10 students in his class today. He says schools will likely be empty in the fall unless CPS follows through on in-school vaccine clinics.
That doesn't risk their health, their well-being, and that of their family, that this should be a priority. We have the resources, we have the infrastructure, we have the people, but we have the opportunity to do this correctly. Rhetoric does nothing here. We need to take what we have and put it into motion.
This criticism comes as the President Joe Biden has set a goal. Here's that date again, July 4th, for 70% of the U.S. population to be at least partially vaccinated. Now, as for that July 4th reopening, Mayor Lightfoot says the auto show is not the only announcement she's got planned.
There's more that's coming. We feel very confident about what the summer is going to look like. I've said this over and over again, that the summer of 2021 will look more like the summer of 2019 than 2020. We feel confident based upon what we're seeing in the data, based upon what our modeling is.
That is a far cry, that optimism, from what Mayor Lightfoot said was one of her grimmest days of 2020. And that was when she decided with others to close down McCormick Place because of the pandemic, and then ultimately not only shutting it down, but then turning it into a makeshift COVID hospital that mercifully really didn't need to be used because there wasn't that overflow of patients. Now, McCormick at this point, not the only convention center looking to reopen in the summer. Also today, news coming that the Donald E. Stevens Convention and Conference Center in Rosemont is likewise looking to host events in July. Now, pre-pandemic, holding some 70 conventions and 250 meetings there, bringing in $800 million annually in economic impact. So they're also looking forward to a hopeful reopening. With that, Brenda, back to you.
Lots of people looking for that, Amanda. Thank you. And now to Paris with local members of Congress. Paris.
Brandis, President Joe Biden laid out his vision for a massive, once-in-a-generation agenda of investments last week before a joint session of Congress. Here is what he had to say yesterday.
I think it's about time we start giving tax breaks and tax credits to working-class families and middle-class families instead of just the very wealthy. And here's what the American Family Plan doesn't do. It doesn't add a single penny to our deficit. It's paid for by making sure corporate America and the wealthiest 1% just pay their fair share.
And joining us now to talk about the American Families Plan and much more are Congressman Sean Casten, a Democrat from Downers Grove, Congresswoman Marie Newman, a Democrat from Chicago's Southwest Side, and Congresswoman Robin Kelly, a Democrat from Madison and now chair of the Democratic Party of Illinois. And we invited every Republican member of the Illinois congressional delegation. None accepted our invitation, but we do thank you all for joining us. Congresswoman Newman, a lot of investments announced, first with infrastructure and now with this $1.8 trillion American Families Plan. Before we get to the cost, tell us what's in this plan.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the American Families Plan is well named because it's everything that has to do with families, education, health care, support for all of your employment. So what we have to think about is that in combination with the infrastructure plan, the other part of our infrastructure is the American family. So things like child tax credits, access to free college, community college, making sure our workforce is trained, and making sure that we're starting to cut poverty. So all of those things that help support a 21st century economy are critical in tandem with the American Jobs Plan to really move forward in a dimensionalized fashion for our American society. So I'm thrilled to see the content in there.
Trillions of dollars in investments here, and Congressman Caston, as you said, at least as it relates to, as you saw, as it relates to this American Families Plan, it would be paid for by higher taxes on those making more than $400,000 and on corporations. Does that mean it's going to be next to impossible to get any Republican support here?
Well, 2 points on that. Number one, a lot of these things are stimulative of the economy, making sure that people can live up to their potential, making sure that children aren't in poverty, providing more generous Pell Grants, getting kids into early childhood education. These are going to provide returns regardless of how we pay for them. I would hope we can get some Republicans on board. I mean, some of the provisions, you've talked about the headlines, but some of the things are funding the IRS to make sure that they actually can do the audit. The audit rate is down 80% over the last 10 years for people making more than $1 million a year. That's not changing the tax rates. That's just making sure that people go through. There's some really clever stuff they've got in there of saying let's require financial institutions to provide disclosures if anybody has a bank account with a taxable transaction in the same way you do with the W-2, because there's a huge amount of tax fraud that goes through people not paying taxes. Should we make sure our tax structure is more equitable? Of course we should. But I think on balance, there should be some things that folks on both sides of the aisle should say, yeah, whatever the tax code is, we should make sure we enforce the laws that we have.
And here's what was said about negotiating both infrastructure and the Families Plan. President Biden said, quote, "We're going to work with Republicans. We're going to find common ground." Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell said, "I think it's worth talking about, but I don't think there will be any Republican support. None. Zero." Congresswoman Kelly, does it make sense to try and negotiate with Republicans on either infrastructure or American Families Plan, if you hear what the Senate Minority Leader says there?
I always think that we should try to negotiate and have a bipartisan effort. I think we should give it our all, but if it doesn't work out, we need to move ahead. There was polling done, and the American people said they wanted us to work in a bipartisan manner, but bigger than that, they wanted us to get things done. So if we have to move ahead without the Republicans, then that's what we have to do. But I think that we have to try for bipartisanship, but if it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out.
There do seem to be bipartisan negotiations on the Justice and Policing Act, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, or police reform in general. Congresswoman Newman, are there hopes of passage of that, and what would that bill do?
Yeah, and I think that they're real. I think that the combination of Tim Scott getting together with Senator Booker and Congresswoman Karen Bass to have a more particular conversation around the content of the bill. Here's what is most important, is the American people want this done. They want justice in policing and police reform. That doesn't mean taking away public safety or policing. It does mean that we want a better, more 21st century model of public safety, and then support for our neighborhoods and healthcare services. So all the wraparound services are presented at the same time, and everybody gets what they need instead of just having one element of community policing.
So we'll have to see where those negotiations go. Also, that passed the Senate late last week, Congressman Casson, a bill sponsored by Illinois Senator Tammy Duckworth to provide trillions of dollars for water infrastructure upgrades. You know that Illinois and Chicago have a problem with lead service lines. Do you think that transitioning out of those lead service lines, will that be 100% funded by Congress? Because a lot of local governments are afraid of the costs here of doing that.
Well, I certainly look forward to seeing it. It's delightful to see what Senator Duckworth has done. Look forward to seeing that in the House. I actually was just on a call today with folks in Westmont, in my district, talking about exactly this issue. That a lot of newer homes, they don't have lead anymore, but it's that last service connection that needs to go through, and it's just a gap, right? That the towns know what they pay for on one side, the homeowners know what they pay for. But it's that last segment, and I'm delighted to see Senator Duckworth's leadership on this. Look forward to seeing what we might be able to push through in the House and do something jointly to get to the president's desk. Congresswoman
Kelly, you saw President Biden talk about, in his address to the nation, gun legislation, another ban on assault weapons, closing the gun show loophole, universal background checks. Obviously very important to your constituents in Chicago as we see more and more guns on the streets every year. Any bipartisan movement on any of those? I know there has been action in the House.
Well, the background check bill and the Charleston loophole were both passed in a bipartisan fashion. It's just getting it called in the Senate. That has been our heartburn and heartbreak. And I'm hoping at some point soon that we can get these pieces of legislation passed. Gun violence was even worse during the COVID 2020 year, and it's not getting better in 2021. Suicides have also increased during this time, and most successful suicides are done by guns. So we need to move forward. We need to move forward on the trafficking that the president talked about also. Very, very important in the Chicagoland area.
Absolutely, and we're going to leave it there for now. But later in the program, we'll be joined again by Congress members to discuss Illinois losing a seat in the House. For now, our thanks to Representatives Sean Casten, Marie Newman, and Robin Kelly. And now to Phil Ponce and how a proposed ban on menthol cigarettes could impact health outcomes. Phil.
Thanks, Paris. The Food and Drug Administration plans to ban menthol cigarettes and flavored cigars. Tobacco companies have long marketed menthol products to Black Americans who use them at a significantly higher rate, according to the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention, than other groups. The CEO of the NAACP calls the likely ban long overdue, but some are concerned it could lead to the further criminalization of communities of color. Joining us to discuss the proposed ban are Christina Hamilton. She's Director of Advocacy at the American Lung Association in Illinois and Iowa, and Dr. Clyde Yancey, Vice Dean of Diversity and Inclusion at Northwestern University and Chief of Cardiology in the Department of Medicine. And thank you both for joining us. Christina Hamilton, let me begin with you. First of all, basic primer. What exactly is a menthol cigarette? How is it different from a cigarette that doesn't have menthol?
Sure. So menthol is a chemical naturally found in peppermint and other mint plants, and it can also be made in a lab. So it was first added to tobacco products in the 1920s and 1930s, and it is known to reduce the harshness and the irritation from tobacco and nicotine. Under the 2009 Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act that gave the FDA authority over tobacco products, menthol is the only flavoring that is allowed in cigarettes as a characterizing flavor because of the amount of menthol that's in those types of cigarettes. But almost all cigarettes contain at least some menthol in them.
Well, as you probably know, according to the FDA, roughly 85% of black tobacco-using adults smoke menthol cigarettes. That's compared to about 48% of Hispanic or Latino adults and roughly 30% of white adults. Dr. Yancey, why is the rate so high among African Americans?
It's fairly clear that there's been disproportionate marketing of mentholated products, tobacco products, and as a result, there's disproportionate use. Unfortunately, because the taste has been obliterated with menthol, the addiction potential of tobacco is extraordinary. And those smokers end up being lifelong smokers and then experience the disproportionality of tobacco-related diseases.
Christina Hamilton, how would you describe just how aggressive tobacco companies have been marketing menthol products to African Americans?
The predatory marketing practices of the biggest tobacco companies dates back to the 1960s. There's a 1998 U.S. Surgeon General's report that highlights the intentional, very targeted marketing to portray Black people in a positive light. They're radiant and poised, and they look happy, and they're using these products. And they did this at a time when the pervasive images in the media of Black people were negative. And these practices, they were rampant throughout the Black community and really became effective in appealing to Black people and getting them hooked on these very harmful products.
Dr. Yancey, what would be the impact if this proposal were, in fact, to become policy? What impact would it have on African American communities?
Well, think about the impact that smoking in the African American communities has right now. At least 40 to 50,000 excess deaths per year in the community attributable to tobacco. If we can reverse any of that, it would be extraordinary. But recognize this is just one step towards reducing the burden of tobacco in those communities and just one step towards transitioning to heart healthier lifestyles. But the step is necessary.
Well, as you probably know, there is some concern about how a ban might impact black and brown communities. Let's listen to Nusra Choudhury at the ACLU, Illinois.
It will likely lead to criminal penalties, both under federal law and under state and local law. And that's because when the FDA bans menthol cigarettes, every state in the country, including Illinois, has laws that criminalize the unlicensed sale of tobacco products. And that would mean that there would be an underground market of menthol cigarettes. And because there are so many people who use these products who are people of color, that leaves them open to police stops and encounters that can escalate and cause harm.
She went on to note that Eric Gardner, as you recall, was killed by police after a traffic stop for selling loose cigarettes. How about it? Is there a concern, Christina Hamilton, that number one, there'd be an underground market for menthol cigarettes, and number two, that African American and Latino individuals would be targeted by law enforcement?
The FDA's announcement is targeted at the tobacco industry. It does not penalize or criminalize the behavior of individuals. This is about stopping the commercial manufacturing, distribution, and selling of a tobacco product. We agree that criminal penalties for addicted smokers would be harmful. The FDA cannot and will not enforce against an individual consumer for possessing or using menthol cigarettes. This is about saving Black lives, not criminalizing them. And it's also disappointing that organizations who currently or previously have taken tobacco industry money have been outspoken in their opposition of this life-saving proposal.
Dr. Yancey, some people look at menthol cigarettes and say that they're an easy gateway. There's something inherent about them that makes them more addictive, more attractive to young people, for example. What are your thoughts on that?
Exactly. I think anything that allows the access to have a lesser barrier really does promote chronic use. We already know from the science that it only takes 2 weeks of exposure to a tobacco product in a young adult or a child to develop at least a dependency, if not an addiction. 2 weeks. And so this really is a sinister campaign that has to be halted because it's really leading to lifelong behaviors that are just simply not healthy.
Christina Hamilton, last question for you. What comes next? Do you think this ban will actually happen?
The American Lung Association and our partners are certainly going to be urging the FDA to quickly propose their rule on menthol cigarettes and flavored cigars. The FDA has said that in up to 12 months, they will release their proposed rule, and we urge them to do that faster. From there will be about a 90-day comment period. And then after that, the FDA will take some time to review all of those comments. And then under the 2009 Tobacco Control Act, there would be an effective date that would be 1 year out. So this will be a process, but our organizations, our volunteers, we will be certainly making our voices heard to the FDA that this is a good policy and that they should move forward.
As will the American Heart Association.
Christina Hamilton, Dr. Clyde Yancey, thank you both. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And up next, how a social justice theater group is using the art of storytelling to unify Chicago. So stay with us.
And there is much more ahead on the program, including local Congress members and their take on Representative Liz Cheney's comments about former President Trump. But first, thanks to support from the Illinois Department of Public Health, Chicago theater company Collaboration is exploring the impact of oral history with one story at a time. Arts correspondent Angel Ito introduces us to its newest project, Family Tree Stories, and how it's working to unite the city through storytelling.
What is a story? A story is an artistic form of a life. And we believe that by sharing our stories with each other, we share our lives with each other.
It's a new project by Collaboration, Chicago's Theater for Social Change, entitled Family Tree Stories. Located on its website, the video series features oral histories from a number of Chicago storytellers. The hope is to not only honor family histories, but use the strength of storytelling as a way to connect one another.
We become informed of the past through the telling of stories.
Loretta Firekeeper Hawkins is a member of one of the 15 featured families. Her stories, which she shared in the form of spoken word, were the same stories she'd heard growing up from her mother.
Red bone, tan, or ebony. If your old folks come from Africa, we be family.
Priya Shaya says the stories her mother shared with her growing up have formed her identity.
What I spoke about was, I have Indian heritage, but my mom actually grew up in Africa and, living in East Africa under colonial British rule. And so the things that you understand, about how cultures really intersect and how that really flows together. And a lot of my mom's roots is still very much African, right? She considers herself Ugandan and, more than considering herself Indian sometimes, because that's where she grew up. And that was the culture that she came through. And the storytelling around it is powerful enough that it even makes me feel that I am more connected to Africa as well as being Indian.
With the help of a map of the city, people can search keywords or certain neighborhoods as a way to visualize how the stories and the experiences are connected.
These things and habits of human behavior really are repetitive. And so if we look back about what has happened before us, we can see that we can do them again if we don't understand the implications of our behaviors.
We cultivate stories that gives us insight into what it means to belong to each other and all the forces that are there pulling us apart. And our issue is, can we understand the systems that pull us apart well enough to navigate ourselves back towards one another and find each other in dialogue?
When we share our lives with each other, especially the things that we have overcome or that have hurt us deeply, we make ourselves vulnerable to one another, and we actually make ourselves able to change both ourselves and each other. And what better way to learn and grow than to do that with a community of people?
For Chicago Tonight, I'm Angel Ito.
And the next phase of the Family Tree Stories project requires input from you. The public will soon be able to upload and submit their own video recordings to be included in the Family Tree Library. And now, Brandis, we go back to you.
Paris, thank you. Still to come on Chicago Tonight, details of a new report that aims to redefine the narratives of women who've been incarcerated in Illinois.
We should not be embracing the former president.
Local members of Congress debate the high price Representative Liz Cheney may pay for speaking her mind. And internet cookies may optimize one's user experience, but what if that personal data falls into the wrong hands? Two tech minds break it down for us. But first, some more of today's top stories. The Chicago Police Department says it has taken a step forward in its ongoing accountability efforts. CPD says it's launched a new web-based portal that will allow members of the public to access detailed reports on officer complaints. These administrative summary reports will include information such as date, time, location, and the nature of a complaint against an officer, as well as evidence, the name of the accused officer, and the outcome once the complaint has been closed. This portal dates back to 2012, but the city's inspector general has encouraged city council to create a more comprehensive database of misconduct files dating back to 1994 that he argues would be a major step toward transparency for the department. There's more of that story on our website. Most of the trading pits at CME Group will not reopen again even after the pandemic. The Chicago-based Derivatives Exchange announced it's permanently closing its physical trading pits for all products other than euro-dollar options. CME closed its pits in last March 2020, due to the pandemic. Most of its trading platform has already moved to electronic trading before the pandemic began. And now, Paris, back to you with more from local members of Congress. Paris.
Thanks, Brandis. Earlier in the program, we discussed President Biden's aggressive agenda, and now we're joined again by Representatives Sean Casten, Marie Newman, and Robin Kelly. We invited every Republican member of the Illinois congressional delegation. None accepted our invitation. Once again, we're glad that you're all here. I want to talk about redistricting, the census. The apportionment numbers are out. As expected, Illinois will lose a seat in Congress. And Congresswoman Kelly, we also got the announcement that Representative Sherry Bustos, who represents central and western Illinois around the Quad Cities there, she is going to step down in 2022. That's a very middle-of-the-road district. Are you worried that that's going to be a difficult one for Democrats to hang on to?
No, I think that, we don't know what the mapping will look like yet, but if it's, done right and done as much as we can to make sure that we have a fair chance of keeping the seat and winning the seat, I think that will be okay. And I know that's how Sherry feels also.
And Congressman Casten, as we mentioned, the state does lose a seat. That means, someone who's currently in the delegation now will not be. Obviously, if Democrats do have their way drawing the map, it would probably be a Republican district. What do you think is going to happen to the map?
Look, the important thing is we need to do fair mapping. Let's trust our people to do the maps fairly to make sure that we're all represented properly. As far as what's happened, I think, and we won't know this until we get all the detailed information back, but I think that what we've seen in Illinois is really a part of a broader national trend of the rural areas are depopulating. Illinois has lost population, but I expect that most of that population loss is going to be downstate. And since, congressional districts, if we do the math right, we all represent roughly the same number of people. That means that those downstate districts are probably going to get bigger. And, I think the estimates are that the Chicagoland suburbs, the population has been flat, maybe slightly rising. Maybe there's been a slight migration from the city to the suburbs. We'll have to see, but that detailed granular level data, including making sure that we didn't have any undercounts in areas of some of the harder to reach communities, we really won't know that for certain until August.
And Congresswoman Kelly, I want to go back to you for a second. You are the head of the Democratic Party. You said draw the maps right. I mean, do you support the Democratic Party, continuing to sort of hold sway over this process? As you know, Governor Pritzker had campaigned on an independent commission, and now is saying that that's not going to be the case. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, it's really up to President Harmon and Speaker Welch to put everything together. They draw their maps, and then they draw the congressional maps too. And from my conversations with them, they want to make sure it is a fair map representing the diversity of the state, and they want communities to feel that they have a say. So in my conversations with them, that's what they want to do. So I have full faith in them that these type of maps will be drawn. All
right, let's move over to the issue with Congresswoman Liz Cheney. Former President Donald Trump, he told an audience at his Mar-a-Lago club last week that a partisan-led vote recount in Arizona will find more votes for him, he believes. Take a look at what he said and Republican leader Liz Cheney's response.
Let's see what they find. I wouldn't be surprised if they found thousands and thousands and thousands of votes. So we're going to watch that very closely. And after that, you'll watch Pennsylvania and you'll watch Georgia and you're going to watch Michigan and Wisconsin.
We should not be embracing the former president.
All right, so and Liz Cheney basically calling it the big lie, this lie that the election was stolen. Obviously, the former president saying things that are patently false. Congresswoman Marie Newman, what does it say about the GOP here that Cheney does risk losing her leadership position, and do you believe that's what's going to happen?
Well, I think Congresswoman Cheney is representing principles that we don't often see in the Republican Party. So good on her for speaking truth to power. And then further, I mean, everybody that talks about this Arizona audit, it's ridiculous, right? We've already certified the election, so you can't do anything about it. They've spent a lot of money on this and manpower, and there's nothing that can be done with whatever result that they come up with, how wacky it is. So it is a colossal waste of time and money. But I appreciate Liz Cheney's comments, and I hope she continues to speak truth to power.
Congressman Casten, when you talk to members of Congress in the Republican Party about this issue, I mean, what do they tell you? You have a lot of them now trying to sort of hedge, avoid the issue. The leader, Kevin McCarthy, at first had admonished the president for his action on January 6th and walked that back a little bit. What are you hearing from your colleagues?
It's pretty tense right now. I'll be honest, Paris. You know, January 6th was not that long ago. The clip you just played of Donald Trump, this is a small, broken man who simply cannot accept math and cannot understand that for 535 plus president and vice president, 537 of us who are federally elected have the honor of holding an office that we must all appreciate is bigger than us. The peaceful transfer of power is core to this government. And the fact that 137 members of the Republican caucus, after the House was attacked, after they were incented to attack us, as Liz Cheney said, you inflamed the mob. After they came, 137 members of the House GOP voted with them to overturn the results of election, including some of them in states where they were just elected. And there's a challenge. We can all disagree. We may have wild differences of opinion on the policy issues of the day, and it's our power to vote. But for folks who voted to take away the votes of other people, it's hard. And that, in the Republican caucus, I think right now is split between those who are, either too cowardly to stand up or who are hostile to the idea of democracy. And I give tremendous credit to Liz Cheney for not taking either of those two doors. I just wish that she wasn't in such a lonely position in her caucus.
We only have a few seconds. Congresswoman Kelly, what does that portend for your ability to work across the aisle as you have most of the Republican Party basically spreading this very dangerous lie about the election and going forward saying that?
Well, I've always worked in a very bipartisan way since I've come to Congress, but I'm not going to lie that since the insurrection, where myself and Sean Casten were on our knees hoping to get out of the gallery. I don't work with as many Republicans as I used to, but I still work with Republicans that, gave Joe Biden his credentials and voted for that. So I still try to work with some. And even when I saw Liz Cheney, I just said to her, hang in there. But no, I don't work with as many as I used to because it's absolutely ridiculous what they're trying to do. And I give Liz Cheney, not that we voted like, but all the credit in the world for hanging in there.
Certainly tense situation, and our thanks to Representatives Sean Casten, Marie Newman, and Robin Kelly. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And now, Brandis, we go back to you.
Paris, thank you. At the end of last year, there were about 1,400 women in Illinois' prison system. One group is aiming to cut that number in half. Detailed in the report, Redefining the Narrative, a task force of hundreds of experts, researchers, and formerly incarcerated women put together a list of recommendations to not only cut the population, but to better support women while in and out of prison. Joining us are three women who worked on the report. Colette Payne, the director of the Reclamation Project at the Women's Justice Institute. Deanne Banos, the co-founder of the Women's Justice Institute, and Amanda Ward, a senior research associate at Loyola University's Center for Criminal Justice Research, Policy, and Practice. Thanks to the three of you for joining us. Colette Payne, let's start with you, please. As someone who has been previously incarcerated, what does it mean to you to be able to redefine the narrative about women in prison?
Absolutely, and I just want to say thank you for having Justice Institute. So when you look at false narratives that fuel mass incarceration, the narratives that we have been fed from society, by society, that we're not good mothers, if we have possibly used substances we are not deserving of. I was one of those mothers, and many of my peers were as well. And to redefine the narratives means that we're recreating a structure that women who have been impacted are a part of in leading and paving the way for other women.
Amanda Ward, throughout the 80s and the 90s, the women's prison population in the state, it increased by 776%, taking us to the higher numbers that we see today. What has caused that massive increase?
The increase that we saw in the number of women who are incarcerated in prison during the 80s, 90s, and much of the aughts was the result of more women being admitted to prison for low-level class 3 and 4 felonies. These are the least serious of felonies, and primarily and largely for nonviolent crimes, particularly drug-related crimes such as possession.
And Deanne, could you briefly explain, let's get to the report now, briefly explain, if you will, the 3 goals of this report.
So when we convened with 100 women, ended up reaching 500 women or more statewide, we set 3 goals. The first was to devise a plan to cut the women's prison population by 50% plus and beyond, meaning we go for the first 50 and then we keep going. Very similar to the juvenile justice movement that led to a 69% reduction in the number of young people incarcerated in our state. The second goal was to reduce harm to impacted women, their children, families, and communities. There are people impacted by the system that continue to be entrenched by the system. We can't leave people behind because our prison conditions for women are deplorable in our state. And the third goal was to ensure that we're creating recommendations that improve the well-being and outcomes of women. Colette talked about redefining justice. Justice means health. It means relationship safety. It doesn't mean whether you've been arrested or not, or whether a woman who's been sexually assaulted, as 98% of women in our prisons have experienced gender-based violence and other forms of abuse and related trauma that paved their pathway to prison. Justice begins well before. So when we measure what real justice is and we measure outcomes and well-being, it means what are we doing before? What are we doing during and after in touching the system for women? Because when you have 98% gender-based violence survivors, 80% mothers, incarcerated in a system, and 58% of women in our system on a mental health caseload compared to 24% of men. Yet our women's prisons have 40% staff shortages for mental health services. That's not justice, right? That's where our public health system could pave the way. And that's why there were so many recommendations there.
Absolutely. And Amanda, working through some of that data and building on, what we just heard from Deanne, how did you develop that 50% cut goal?
Yeah, absolutely. So what we did is we looked at every single point in criminal justice policy from prior to arrest through arrest, sentencing, time in prison, and reentry. And we identified strategies and policies that would reduce the number of women who moved their way through the system. And I want to emphasize here that when I say that we identified policies, this isn't just our hopes, this isn't just our dreams. We did sophisticated statistical analyses to see what the actual impact would be of our policies that we suggest in this report. So things like reducing the number of women who fall into that category of class 3 and 4 nonviolent felonies who end up even getting arrested, right? Crisis intervention. The number of women who, once arrested, are sentenced to prison, an increased reliance on probation, for example. And the number of women who have access to prison programming credits that would not only provide women with the opportunity to earn time off their sentence, but reduce the likelihood that they would find themselves back in prison again.
And you also look at, of course, disciplinary action. Colette, women face disciplinary action at higher rates than men. On top of that, women of color face even higher rates, like with solitary confinement. If you would talk a little bit about this harsher discipline and that further discrimination that women of color face while imprisoned.
Absolutely. It looks different for women than it does for men when it comes to disciplinary actions. So I can give you a few examples. Say, for example, me being a woman who has suffered some type of form of abuse. I have had correctional officers hollering at me, telling me, hey, you're out of compliance. And what that looks like for me is the abuse that I experienced in my own community, the abuse that I experienced with my own partner. So that's what it looks like. We have to look at how women are being treated and treat them according to gender. So that's gender responsiveness. Of course, we are different. You know, oftentimes we hear, okay, well, what about the men? Well, what about the women? How are we being treated?
And
yeah,
before,
that's what it looks like.
And before we run out of time, Deanne, we've got, I think, about 30 seconds left. What is next? How do you turn this report into action?
Well, we call it the $1 billion proposition because we spent $1 billion on the last decade for a system with failed outcomes to send women to prison 20,000 times, right? And to continue to perpetuate harm with their children. The House Democratic Women's Caucus, Representative Camille Lilly, Representative Croak, LaPointe, and Ramirez are going to host a series of subject matter hearings on women's justice reinvestment strategies so that we can look at how we transform state tax dollars into real outcomes and to build our communities rather than decimate them. Okay. And that begins with investing in women.
And that's obviously something that we will keep following going forward. In the meantime, my thanks to Colette Payne, Amanda Ward, and Deanne Benos for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Up next, cookie concerns. Internet cookies, that is. But first, a look at the weather.
Coverage of science and technology on Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Joel M. Friedman, president of the Alvin H. Baum Family Fund.
Most of us are aware of the cookies you take out of the oven, but how about the ones that store your data on the internet? If you surf the web regularly, chances are you've seen a pop-up when visiting a website asking for permission to use cookies. Tiny data files containing a user's personal information or preferences. While cookies can enhance a user's online experience, there are still privacy concerns that your data could fall into the wrong hands. Joining us to unpack internet cookies are Blaze assistant professor of computer science at the University of Chicago, and Derek Eder, founder of the data consultancy DataMade and weekly tech event Shy Hack Night. Welcome both of you back to Chicago Tonight. So Blaze, absolutely. Blaze, let's start with you, please. What are cookies, not the oatmeal raisin kind, and how do they impact our internet experience?
Sure. Cookies are small files that your web browser basically collects as you visit different websites. And they were originally designed to be able to store information. So typically when you visit a website and go to like the next page, the website wouldn't know, hey, you're the same person. So it's named after actually, in fact, fortune cookies, where you have a small little bit of information in there. And there's a distinction that's going to become actually important as our conversation goes on between first-party cookies and third-party cookies, where if you're going to WTTW's website and WTTW stores a cookie, that's a first-party cookie. If, however, on the WTTW website, it's loading ads from Google, and Google also stores a cookie, that's a third-party cookie, and that's where a lot of the tracking across websites you visit happens.
So if someone does click no to alert, to that asking permission alert to use cookies, does that change the website experience?
Go for it, Derek.
I'll go ahead and take this one. Yeah, so it actually depends, right? Some websites will respect that, but others won't, right? Some of these websites will just have the trackers on by default and won't ask your permission. In fact, in the US, that's pretty typical for most websites. It's only been introduced to websites in Europe in the last few years, thanks to some privacy legislation that was passed a number of years ago that ask your permission. But by default, hey, you're being tracked.
And we are going to get to that GDPR that you that I think as you were just referring to in just a minute. But Derek, is there a difference between what some might call essential cookies, like data for logging in, and those that are less essential, more arbitrary cookies?
Yeah, so essential cookies are just as Blaze described. They're cookies that are helpful for remembering your login on your websites. They're fundamental parts of the web, and those are going to stick around for a long time. Those are really useful tools. But then there's these other cookies that are used for tracking advertising. So you can go to one website and have a cookie set by one of these tracking websites, and then you can go to a number of other websites and still be tracked by those same services. And all that information feeds in to these vast advertising networks that can track and make value out of that data and know where you've been, which is something that can be really valuable to them to figure out what to show you in terms of other ads.
So, Blaze, how do cookies pose a security or a privacy risk, and what could happen if that information should get into the hands of hackers?
So I think in a lot of cases, in your typical browsing, the biggest risk is privacy. So as you're browsing the web, a lot of advertisers will assign you a pseudonym, essentially. And now every site you visit that also includes, for instance, ads or other content hosted by that advertiser, the advertiser knows what page you've been on by the way that the web is constructed. And so I think that's probably for the average internet user the biggest risk. There are also security risks in specific situations. So as Derek mentioned before, when you're logged in, the information about how you're logged in is stored in a cookie as well. And so if someone gets that, for instance, by snooping on your Wi-Fi connection or by installing malware or viruses onto your computer that steals those cookies, they're actually if they steal your Facebook session cookie, they're logged into Facebook as you. So there are both privacy and security risks in different situations.
So a big reason, of course, for website alerts asking for permission to use cookies, I think everybody started to notice it happen a couple of years ago, was the General Data Protection Regulation, that sweeping data privacy law passed by the European Union back in 2018. Are there additional or further efforts to limit the use of cookies, either by policymakers or internet browser companies themselves? Blaze, I'll throw that one to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think some of the most effective actions in recent years have been from the browser vendors. So Mozilla Firefox changed its default cookie policy. So for instance, the third-party tracking cookies, the ones that are used to profile your interests across websites, Firefox now blocks those by default. There's a privacy protective web browser called Brave Browser that also blocks lots of third-party cookies and has many other privacy protective features. And fellow Chicagoans are actually core parts of their privacy team. And so these browsers have been pushing away advertisers' ability to track people with third-party cookies. And so a lot of recent proposals by the advertising industry I would characterize as a bit of a panic move that their ability to track is slowly being eroded by browser vendors.
Derek, is there a middle ground here between data privacy and the optimal internet experience? Like, is asking for this permission for these cookies, is it enough? Or should we do away with cookies for the sake of privacy?
It's a great question. It's hard to challenge something that's been around for so long, and the internet's foundation is really mostly built on advertising. So it's a huge multi-trillion-dollar industry, it feels like, that has with all this data. And so I think what people really need to do is to learn a little bit more about what these kinds of systems can do. And I think the more they learn about it, the more rightfully kind of creeped out they are by it. So as far as the middle ground goes, I think people are slowly trying to take back some of those privacy rights. You see that with, as you mentioned, GDPR. There's policies that have actually been pushing against this. I think it unfortunately needs to keep going in that direction. I really do feel like we need to have more regulation and more privacy, and people need to really have ownership of their own data and rather than being surveilled constantly by unseen forces.
And meanwhile, maybe a regular cookie purge on your computer and in your pantry. My thanks to Blaze and Derek Eder for joining us. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And that's our show for this Tuesday night.
Please join us tomorrow night live at 7.
Now, for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Brandis Friedman.
And I'm Paris Schutz. Thank you for watching. Stay healthy and safe, and have a great night.
Closed captioning for this program is brought to you by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, serving Chicago as a personal injury law firm since 1984.